The tropical darkness swallows everything whole on this December night. One full year has passed since Pearl Harbor changed the world forever. Waters off the Solomon Islands hold secrets that could shift the entire Pacific War. Lieutenant Roland Westholm's fingers clamp around the steering mechanism of his patrol torpedo boat. The metal feels ice-cold, despite the humid air pressing against his skin. Diesel exhaust mingles with the sharp smell of fear-induced perspiration in the tiny command area. Executive Officer Ensign Bryant Larson stands at his shoulder. Both young men peer into blackness so complete it seems solid. These waters have already claimed dozens of ships from both sides. Understanding the full scope of their situation requires grasping one crucial fact. These officers had never faced real combat before. Westholm's arrival in theater counted in weeks, not months. Tonight marked PT-109's baptism by fire. The very same vessel that would eventually make John Kennedy famous now carried two frightened young Americans toward the most formidable naval squadron in the Pacific Ocean. Instrument dials cast pale light across the cramped bridge space. Multiple engine monitors, navigation compass, pressure readings that seem to highlight their desperate circumstances. 80 feet of laminated wood and tropical hardwood. 50 tons standing against 11 Japanese destroyers mounting shells weighing 240 pounds each. Basic mathematics suggested certain death. Every possible method of gaining tactical advantage on the approaching enemy formation, Larson later remembered, seemed worth attempting despite the obvious risks. Yet the question of whether survival was even possible hung in the stifling air like moisture before a storm. From the forward gun position, a heavy machine gun barrel pointed uselessly into absolute nothingness. Complete darkness prevented Westholm from seeing his own bow section. Radio communications crackled through bridge-mounted speakers. 8 patrol boats spread across Iron Bottom Sound, like insects preparing to challenge a massive predator. The seafloor beneath their hulls had earned its ominous designation through accumulated tragedy. Allied and Japanese vessels by the dozens rested in the crushing depths, their twisted metal creating an underwater necropolis stretching across miles of ocean floor. Additional men would certainly die in these cursed waters before dawn arrived. The only unknown factor remained whose blood would join the coral and steel cemetery below. Westholm adjusted his stance, feeling his boat respond to the slightest body movement. 3 powerful engines idled beneath the deck plates. These motors represented the only barrier between his crew and the devastating depth charges carried by Japanese destroyers. 1,200 horsepower total. Maximum velocity of 41 knots. 13 wooden hulls that would shatter like kindling under concentrated enemy fire. However, Japanese high command had failed to comprehend something vital. No amount of strategic planning could have prepared them for this reality. The smallest military forces sometimes possess the greatest fighting spirit. Occasionally, 17-year-old recruits from industrial cities and farm boys transformed into sailors can alter history's course with nothing except raw courage and 3 torpedo launch tubes. Static filled the radio channels. A Coast Watcher's transmission cut through the electronic noise. Tokyo Express formation has departed Shortland Harbor. 11 destroyers under Captain Sato's command. Westholm's jaw muscles tightened involuntarily. Somewhere in the impenetrable darkness ahead, 3,000 Japanese sailors raced toward Guadalcanal, carrying enough provisions to sustain their starving garrison for additional weeks. Only 8 wooden boats, crewed by boys who had never fired weapons in combat, stood between the enemy and their objective. What followed next would demonstrate that fear doesn't always favor the largest guns. 6 hours before the engagement, the tactical plan had appeared almost sensible. almost achievable. Lieutenant Commander Hugh Robinson had unrolled navigation charts across the planning table inside the sweltering operations building on Tulagi Island. Fluorescent lighting buzzed continuously overhead like mechanical insects, while perspiration dripped onto maps showing Iron Bottom Sound. Outside the corrugated metal structure, tropical heat pressed against the walls like a living entity seeking entry. The Tokyo Express operates nightly runs, Robinson had explained to his young patrol boat commanders. His index finger traced the shipping route down the slot, that narrow waterway between parallel Solomon Island chains leading directly to Guadalcanal's contested shores. Destroyer escorts carrying supply containers. They release the drums offshore for ground forces to retrieve at dawn. Westholm examined the chart carefully, attempting to project confidence that remained elusive internally. 8 patrol boats against the Imperial Japanese Navy's most experienced nocturnal fighters. Japanese commanders had been executing these supply operations for months. Their destroyer captains knew every reef formation, every tidal current, every potential hiding position in these treacherous waters. "Sir," Lieutenant Robert Searles had inquired, his tone carefully controlled, "what aerial support can we expect?" Robinson's expression carried no humor whatsoever. One SOC reconnaissance aircraft, possibly available for coordination. Understanding the desperation requires grasping Guadalcanal's critical situation. Marines were dying on beachheads, starving in jungle positions, fighting with ammunition supplies running dangerously low. Each successful Japanese supply mission meant additional enemy soldiers fed, more weapons systems delivered, more American families receiving death notifications. The Tokyo Express had evolved beyond simple logistics into psychological warfare. Every night brought the rumbling sound of Japanese destroyer engines echoing across Iron Bottom Sound. Each dawn revealed fresh supply containers scattered along enemy-controlled beaches. The message remained unmistakably clear. We control these waters after sunset. Captain Torihiro Sato, commanding the Japanese destroyer formation from his flagship bridge, could never have anticipated what awaited him in the approaching darkness. A career naval professional, Sato had invested decades mastering nighttime combat techniques. His destroyers mounted the lethal Type 93 long-lance torpedoes, weapons capable of sinking battleships at ranges exceeding 20 miles. His crews represented veterans of nocturnal engagements across the Pacific Theater. What possible threat could a handful of American torpedo boats present? By 11 o'clock that evening, all tactical pieces had moved into position. Sato's 11 destroyers had already survived one air attack during daylight hours. The destroyer Naganami limped back to base under emergency tow, her engine spaces flooded. 17 sailors confirmed dead. 10 destroyers continued their southern advance. Their cargo holds packed with 2,400 supply containers, sufficient food and ammunition to sustain the Guadalcanal garrison for weeks of continued fighting. Meanwhile, Westholm positioned his boats for what naval historians would eventually classify as one of the most daring attacks in maritime warfare history. PT-1009 and PT-43 would patrol the coastline from Cocombona to Cape Esperance. PT-48 and PT-40 would monitor the northwestern approach routes. 4 additional boats, comprising the strike element, would conceal themselves behind Savo Island, waiting for the decisive moment. The radio equipment alone should have guaranteed mission failure. These high-frequency communication sets were originally designed for aircraft operations, not the constant mechanical punishment of patrol boat service. Atmospheric interference made reliable communication sporadic at best. Japanese forces monitored identical frequencies, transforming every radio transmission into a potential death warrant. The communication equipment suffered from persistent malfunctions. Westholm would later document in his official after-action report. His words deliberately understated a situation that bordered on complete farce. Imagine attempting to coordinate a complex naval assault using radios that functioned approximately 50% of the time, in waters where a single navigational error meant instant destruction. Perhaps the most terrifying aspect wasn't the equipment failures or the overwhelming numerical disadvantage. It was the men themselves, boys, actually, most barely possessing legal voting age, suddenly responsible for commanding sophisticated warships in one of the most dangerous combat zones on Earth. Ensign Bryant Larson had graduated from college less than 24 months earlier. His responsibility tonight involved helping navigate PT-109 through reef formations that could tear open their wooden hull, while simultaneously coordinating torpedo attacks against enemy vessels carrying sufficient firepower to devastate a small city. The Japanese approach demonstrated textbook tactical perfection. Sato had positioned his destroyers in precise formation, supply ships protected in the center, escort vessels guarding the flanks. Radar operators swept the waters ahead, primitive by contemporary standards, but sufficiently advanced to detect large surface targets. What their sensors couldn't identify were small wooden boats operating on muffled engines, their hulls barely registering on early radar screens. At 11:15 that night, lookouts aboard PT-40 spotted the first shadows on the horizon. Lieutenant Henry Taylor grabbed his radio handset, understanding that his next transmission would either coordinate a successful attack or serve as his final communication. The psychological balance was about to shift completely. For months, Japanese destroyer captains had dominated these waters. Their powerful vessels moved with complete impunity through the darkness. They had developed an almost casual confidence in their nighttime superiority. Tonight, they would discover what happens when American innovation encounters desperate courage. Tonight, the predators would become the prey. Radio static crackled, then cleared. Contact report. Multiple vessels bearing southeast, estimated distance 2 miles. Inside PT-109's cramped bridge, Westholm felt his pulse hammering against his ribcage. Beside him, Larson consulted his timepiece. 11:20 at night. In the darkness ahead, 3,000 Japanese sailors were about to learn why Americans had nicknamed these vessels mosquito boats. Mosquitoes, as any Pacific Theater veteran understood, carry deadly diseases. The opening shot split the tropical night like a thunderclap. PT-48's engines screamed at maximum power as Lieutenant Robert Searles threw his boat into a desperate evasive turn, but the maneuver came too late. Japanese searchlights captured his wooden hull against the darkness like a specimen pinned for examination. One engine died immediately. A second motor followed. 50 tons of American torpedo boat suddenly transformed into a helpless target in waters controlled by the Imperial Japanese Navy. "Jesus Christ!" someone shouted over the internal communication system. The profanity was lost beneath the roar of incoming artillery shells. Understanding this scene from the Japanese perspective is crucial. 11 massive destroyers, each displacing over 2,000 tons, bristling with 5-inch naval guns and deadly torpedoes, suddenly confronted by wooden boats that refused to flee. Captain Sato, commanding the destroyer formation from his flagship's bridge, observed through night vision binoculars as his lead vessels opened fire on the crippled patrol boat. The range was point-blank. Less than 200 yards distance, his gunners couldn't possibly miss their target. Lieutenant Henry Taylor in PT-40 had different plans entirely. Taylor spun his boat in a suicidal maneuver that violated every principle of conventional naval warfare. Instead of retreating, he charged directly between the Japanese destroyers and his disabled comrade, laying protective smoke as his three engines screamed at maximum revolutions. Tracer rounds illuminated the night around his position, streams of orange death that missed his boat by mere inches. The audacity was absolutely breathtaking. A 50-ton wooden vessel deliberately drawing fire from ships that outweighed it by a factor of 40 to 1. The tactic worked perfectly. The Japanese destroyers, trained for conventional naval engagements, turned to pursue this new threat. PT-40 vanished into the darkness, her wake creating phosphorescent trails behind her. Searles used the distraction to limp PT-48 to safety behind Savo Island's protective coastline. This represented only the opening sequence. 4 miles to the south, the strike force received the contact information. Lieutenant John Searles in PT-59 opened his throttles completely and charged toward the enemy formation. Behind his position, 3 additional torpedo boats spread into attack configuration, their wakes cutting white lines across the black water surface. The range closed rapidly. 2 miles, 1 mile, 500 yards distance. Fire tube 1, fire tube 2. Lester Gamble in PT-37 launched his torpedoes first. The Mark VIII weapons hissed from their launch tubes like deadly sea creatures. The boat lurched violently as 3,000 pounds of high explosive raced toward the Japanese formation at 46 knots velocity. PT-59 wrote the night's most incredible chapter. Searles brought his boat so close to the destroyer Kuroshio that he could observe individual Japanese sailors manning their gun positions. The range measured less than 100 yards. Suicide distance for a wooden boat engaging steel warships. Both vessels opened fire simultaneously. The destroyer's 5-inch guns boomed like rolling thunder. Shells the size of trash containers whistled overhead, close enough that their passage rocked PT-59's lightweight hull structure. The patrol boat's 50-caliber machine guns and 20-millimeter cannon raked the destroyer's superstructure with thousands of rounds per minute. Motor machinist's mate. Second Class Cletus Osborne was manning the forward gun position when a Japanese shell ignited an ammunition belt beside his station. Flames leaped around him, hot magnesium burning at 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Any rational person would have abandoned their position immediately. Osborne remained, calmly detached the flaming ammunition belt, tossed it onto the deck where other crew members extinguished the fire, then returned to his weapon, continuing to pour fire into the Japanese destroyer as if nothing significant had occurred. He was completely surrounded by flames. One crew member would later testify, but he never stopped firing his weapon. The engagement lasted approximately 3 minutes, an eternity in naval combat terms. PT-59 absorbed at least 10 direct hits from heavy machine guns, her wooden hull splintering under the impact, but miraculously no crew members died. The boat escaped the area under cover of protective smoke. Her crew transformed from boys into combat veterans in the space of a few heartbeats. Meanwhile, Westholm was racing PT-109 toward the sound of gunfire. His boat's 3 engines pushed her at maximum velocity through waters that could conceal reefs, mines, or enemy submarines. Radio chatter had become chaotic. Contact reports, damage assessments, torpedo launch confirmations all mixed together in a symphony of combat communications. Enemy contact was reported. Westholm would later document. They increased speed to approximately 16 knots and proceeded westward along the Guadalcanal coastline. By the time PT-109 reached the engagement area, something unprecedented had occurred. The Japanese destroyer force, 11 powerful warships that should have easily swept aside the American torpedo boats, was withdrawing from the area. Captain Sato, facing an enemy he couldn't comprehend, made a command decision that would haunt the Japanese war effort. These weren't conventional torpedo boats following predictable tactical doctrine. These were fanatics willing to ram destroyers, sailors who refused to retreat even when outgunned 40-1. More critically, the patrol boat attacks had disrupted his carefully synchronized supply schedule. Every minute spent fighting these mosquito boats was a minute his vulnerable destroyers remained in waters dominated by American air power after sunrise. The disposition of the boats at the time was considered optimal to meet all possible enemy approaches, Westholm reported. Even he couldn't have predicted the psychological effect on seasoned Japanese naval officers. For the first time in months, a Tokyo Express supply run had been turned back by surface forces. The SOC reconnaissance aircraft circling overhead confirmed what the patrol boat crews could barely believe. Enemy ships approximately 7 miles northwest of Cape Esperance headed away at high speed. The Japanese were retreating. PT-37 spotted what appeared to be a large vessel run aground near Cape Esperance and launched 2 additional torpedoes. The explosions that followed illuminated the night sky, probably targeting one of the Japanese transports beached during an earlier failed supply attempt. In the chaos and darkness, the patrol boat crews claimed another victory. By midnight, Iron Bottom Sound belonged to 8 American torpedo boats. The transformation was complete. Westholm, who had begun the evening as an untested squadron commander, had just orchestrated one of the most successful small boat actions in naval history. His crews, many of them teenagers 6 months removed from civilian life, had proven that courage and audacity could overcome overwhelming firepower. Perhaps the most profound change had occurred in the minds of Japanese naval commanders. For months, they had operated with virtual impunity in these waters. Their destroyer captains were the elite of the Imperial Navy, veterans of night actions across the Pacific Theater. Tonight, they had been outfought by boys in wooden boats. The psychological impact could not be overstated. Every future Tokyo Express run would now carry the knowledge that American mosquito boats were prowling the darkness, willing to engage forces 10 times their size. The hunters had become the hunted. At 4:15 in the morning, PT-109 responded to a distress call from PT-48, still hiding behind Savo Island with engine difficulties. Westholm carefully approached his disabled comrade and took her under tow, a delicate operation in waters that could still conceal Japanese submarines or patrol craft. As dawn broke over Iron Bottom Sound, 8 American torpedo boats returned to Tulagi Base. Not one man had been killed, not one boat had been lost. 11 Japanese destroyers had retreated without completing their supply mission. The mathematical impossibility had become reality. David had not only faced Goliath, he had sent him running into the night. The morning sun revealed a transformed tactical situation. Lieutenant Roland Westholm secured PT-109 to the tender dock at Tulagi at 5:20 in the morning, his hands steady now despite the night's adrenaline surge. Around him, 7 other torpedo boats returned from what would be remembered as one of the most audacious naval actions in American military history. The crews climbed onto the dock with the quiet confidence of men who had seen themselves under fire and discovered they would not break under pressure. This wasn't simply one successful night patrol operation. This represented the moment everything changed in the Solomon Islands campaign. For 4 months, the Tokyo Express had operated with near-complete impunity. Japanese destroyer captains had developed an almost casual confidence in their nighttime superiority, running supply missions like scheduled commercial routes. American forces could only watch helplessly as enemy reinforcements and supplies reached Guadalcanal under cover of darkness. December 7, 1942, shattered that confidence permanently. Within weeks, rumors spread through the Japanese fleet about the Mosquito boats, American torpedo craft willing to engage destroyers at point-blank range. What had begun as a tactical nuisance evolved into a strategic nightmare for Japanese commanders planning nocturnal operations. Motor Machinist's mate Second Class Cleatus Osborne received the Silver Star for his actions in PT-59's gun position. More importantly, his example became legend among patrol boat crews across the Pacific Theater. When ammunition catches fire around your position, you don't abandon your post. You extinguish the fire and continue fighting. This mindset spread like wildfire through American small craft units. From the Solomons to the Philippines, patrol boat crews embraced a new tactical doctrine. No target was too large, no odds too overwhelming, no mission too dangerous. The psychological warfare cut both directions. While American morale soared, Japanese destroyer captains began planning their routes with patrol boat interference as a primary consideration. Night supply runs required additional escort vessels. Time schedules must account for potential combat delays. The simple presence of these wooden boats in contested waters forced major tactical adjustments throughout the Japanese fleet structure. Admiral William Bull Halsey, commanding South Pacific operations, grasped the broader implications immediately. In his communication to Admiral Chester Nimitz, he wrote, "They are performing heroic services, and it is confidently expected that they will establish a distinguished record of valor and achievement in the service of their country." Halsey understood something more profound than individual heroism. These patrol boat actions represented a new form of naval warfare, asymmetric combat, where small, agile forces could neutralize much larger opponents through superior tactics and unshakable determination. The strategic impact unfolded over subsequent months. Each successful patrol boat action forced Japanese commanders to divert resources from offensive operations to defensive measures. Warships needed for fleet actions must be allocated to escort duties. Supply schedules became increasingly unreliable as patrol boats made night waters too dangerous for routine operations. By February 1943, Japanese forces began their withdrawal from Guadalcanal, a defeat that marked the beginning of their long retreat across the Pacific Ocean. While patrol boat actions alone didn't win the campaign, they played a crucial role in the sustained pressure that made Japanese positions untenable. The human transformation was equally dramatic. Westholm, who began the war as an untested squadron commander, became one of the Pacific's most experienced small boat tacticians. His December 7th action report became required reading at patrol boat training schools. Its tactical lessons were applied from the Aleutians to the Philippines. Ensign Bryant Larson, terrified on PT-109's bridge just months earlier, went on to command his own boat and train new crews in the aggressive tactics pioneered that night in Iron Bottom Sound. The psychological journey from civilian to warrior, compressed into a few hours of combat, became a template for thousands of young Americans thrust into similar situations. Perhaps the most significant legacy lies in proving that technological superiority means nothing without the will to use it effectively. Japanese destroyers carried more advanced radar systems, heavier guns, longer-range torpedoes, and better armor protection than American patrol boats. On paper, the outcome of any engagement should have been predetermined. What the Japanese couldn't account for was the American willingness to press attacks regardless of odds, a cultural trait that would define Pacific warfare for the next 3 years of conflict. Today's naval special operations forces trace their lineage directly to these patrol boat actions, the willingness of small units to engage vastly superior forces, the emphasis on speed and surprise over firepower, the acceptance of enormous risk for strategic gain. All these principles were forged in the tropical waters of Iron Bottom Sound. Modern asymmetric warfare, from missile boats in the Persian Gulf to special operations raids worldwide, follows tactical principles first proven effective by teenagers in wooden boats willing to charge Japanese destroyers in absolute darkness. The next time you hear about impossible odds being overcome through courage and determination, remember December 7, 1942. Remember that sometimes the smallest force carries the biggest heart. Remember that terror doesn't always belong to the biggest gun. If this story of impossible courage inspired you, share it with someone who needs to remember that ordinary people can accomplish extraordinary things. The real secret of patrol boat success wasn't their boats. It was the Americans who sailed them into the night.